Hey everyone, my name is Dak. Welcome to my channel. I am retelling stories from the Bible in the best way I know how for you. If you're inspired by stories of faith, love, and redemption, do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe as it helps out a bunch. Thank you, and above all glory is to God. Introduction. They worked all night, nothing, not a single fish, but then one carpenter's word filled not just a net but two boats almost to sinking. We'll look at Luke 5 and John 1, two moments when empty nets and uncertain hearts turned into a new purpose. You'll see why failure sometimes makes room for calling, and why what looks like an ending can hold the start of something greater. So let's step into that long night by the water, where weary fishermen sit with empty nets in their hands. The long night of failure. The long night of failure is not hard to picture. Your body aches from work, your hands are sore from pulling ropes over and over, and each time the nets come up they're empty. Not one fish to show for the hours already spent. This matters more than frustration. In Galilee, fishing was not recreation, it was survival. The catch fed families, stocked markets, brought income, and kept households stable. Nets without fish meant no food and no trade. For men whose skill and experience had carried them through many nights before, coming back empty was not just disappointing, it was devastating. They were experienced fishermen, so the failure felt final. That night stripped them of confidence in the one place they thought they were strong. Gathering their nets to clean and put away wasn't just a routine task at dawn, it was a way of admitting the effort was finished. That same futility is something we still recognize. You may know what it's like to work hard, to apply what you've learned and still face only emptiness. The disappointment goes deeper than tiredness. It sinks into your heart and asks questions you don't want to answer. What am I doing wrong? Was all this effort wasted? And yet in this story, emptiness itself held possibility. Nets without fish meant space for something else to take place, something they weren't expecting. Just as they settled into discouragement, ready to quit, someone stepped into Simon's boat and spoke a surprising word. A carpenter speaks to fishermen. Why would seasoned fishermen listen to the words of a carpenter? That question sits at the heart of this moment by the waters of Galilee. These men knew the lake like the back of their hands. They had lived on its rhythm since childhood, casting nets through nights and hauling in catches that sustained their families. Their strength came from repetition, from skill passed down through generations. Yet here stood Jesus, a man whose skill was shaping wood, not watching water, and he asked something unexpected. The morning began not with a catch but with a crowd. People pressed in so closely along the shoreline that Simon's boat became a pulpit. What once carried fish now carried a teacher who spoke words that stirred hearts. To Simon, weary from failure, it may have seemed like an intrusion, but the choice to let Jesus teach from his boat opened something new. A carpenter spoke and a fisherman listened. When Jesus finished addressing the crowd, he turned from teaching to commanding. His words went straight to Simon. Go into the deep water. Let down the nets one more time. To any fisherman the request clashed with hard-earned knowledge. Nets were meant for the cover of night, when fish swam close to the surface. The sun was already climbing, driving fish down toward unreachable depths. On top of that, Simon had already rinsed and folded his nets, a clear sign that the workday, however fruitless, was done. By experience and by efficiency, the answer should have been no. Simon's reply carried both honesty and something more. Master, we toiled all night and took nothing, but at your word I will let down the nets. His words named his fatigue and disappointment. He had put in the work and seen nothing for it. Yet his answer shifted with one choice: obedience. In Luke's account, Simon calls Jesus Master, and here Luke uses a rare Greek word, epistata. Luke uses a word here that marks real deference. He calls Jesus epistata, master, leader. It wasn't casual politeness. It was recognition of authority, spoken by someone putting his pride aside. That moment may have felt small, but it held a cost. To say yes to Jesus meant going against everything Simon knew about his trade. His crew had watched him command all through the night. Now he was yielding leadership to someone with no fishing credentials. He knew it made no fishing sense, yet he obeyed. Obedience isn't always about grand displays. Sometimes it's about risking your reputation, doing what others will not understand, and absorbing the awkwardness that follows. The decision to drop the nets again demonstrates what trust looks like in real time. Trust doesn't erase exhaustion or pretend away discouragement. Simon didn't deny his failure, he admitted it plainly. Trust isn't optimism. It's choosing an action because of who speaks, even when reason argues louder. He acted, not because this was practical, but because of the weight of a word that carried authority beyond his own knowledge. The other fishermen surely noticed. Some may have rolled their eyes, others may have thought it a waste to dirty clean nets. The silence before the throw must have carried tension. What if this only proved the carpenter wrong? But in that silence a greater reality was at work. This was the hinge of the story, not the fish themselves, but the act of obedience that opened space for what was coming. We often read this passage waiting for the miracle, the sudden weight of fish in the nets, but the real turning point is earlier. It is the willingness to obey in the midst of fatigue, when catching nothing had already stripped away confidence. Miracles rarely begin with spectacle. More often, they begin with a small, unseen choice: to listen, to act, to risk pride in the face of logic. This scene also reminds us that faith unfolds within our limits, not outside of them. Simon's arms were still heavy. His body was still worn thin. Faith didn't replace his fatigue. It carried him through it. In this way, the act of lowering the nets wasn't only about fish. It was about learning that trust matures not in easy moments, but in ones where weariness makes obedience cost something real. In our lives, the same pattern often comes. You work long, try honestly, and see no results. You feel finished, ready to clean your nets and walk away. Then a quiet nudge urges you to try once more, to take a step that seems impractical or even embarrassing. Obedience at that point isn't glamorous. It's a risk, with no guaranteed outcome except the choice to lean on a word greater than your own. Simon's moment of obedience became a lasting lesson. The carpenter had offered no learned advice about currents or bait. Instead, he offered a command that cut across experience with a single response: "At your word." Simon revealed something deeper than knowledge. He showed trust in the authority of the one speaking, even before the miracle arrived. That act carried weight. It drew a line between trusting what is expected and opening oneself to what God may have planned. By letting down the nets, Simon declared, in action, that the carpenter's word had more authority than the fisherman's certainty. From the shoreline, it looked like a small moment. In truth, it set the stage for something extraordinary. And so the nets went back into the water, sinking into depths that seemed empty. The choice had been made, obedience had spoken, and the water lay still for a moment longer. What followed would show what happens when obedience encounters something far greater than skill. When the nets almost broke, what came next was sudden and startling. The nets dropped into familiar water, the same act repeated thousands of times before, but this time the weight was different. Instead of dragging back light and empty, the ropes pulled heavy, straining under a resistance that grew stronger with every second. Arms that had gone slack from disappointment now stiffened, muscles burning as they tried to hold the lines. The still morning exploded into chaos. Fish did not trickle in. They swarmed until the nets stretched past their limits, cords splitting and fibers snapping as if the catch itself might tear their tools apart. The shouts rose quickly. Simon and his men cried out for help, waving frantically to the second boat. Their partners rowed over, and both crews fought hard to steady nets that threatened to vanish under the weight. The water foamed with movement, and the wooden decks dipped dangerously low. Fish piled one over another, writhing against planks never meant to carry such a load. Luke says their nets began to break and both boats began to sink. The abundance was more than a victory. It was a problem of scale. Nets tearing apart, boats taking on water, men scrambling simply to stay afloat. This was no gradual success. It overturned the failure of the night with one overwhelming moment of fullness. The past hours had yielded nothing, despite all their strength and skill, but a single step of obedience now filled not one boat but two, nearly beyond capacity. That is the contrast Luke records, the sharp shift from repeated emptiness to staggering provision. almost too much to handle. Notice how the blessing did not remain contained within Simon's boat. His choice to listen and obey spread quickly, drawing in his partners James and John. Their vessel, untouched only moments before, groaned now under its own share of the weight. In one act of faith, Simon's obedience reached across the water and multiplied results for others around him. This is often how trust works. It extends beyond one person, pulling others into the overflow of God's provision. The scene must have been both exhilarating and frightening. Instead of celebrating calmly on the water, these men fought to stay focused, working urgently to keep from losing everything back into the sea. The creaking timbers, the snapping cords, the spray of water rising. This was abundance arriving with force. It is easy to imagine laughter mixed with shouting, fear mingled with awe. What began as an ordinary morning of washing nets turned into a scramble to contain what felt impossible. The detail matters. These boats were not built to carry such weight. They were designed for steady catches, enough to feed villages and trade at market, not for an avalanche of fish surging at once. Even the most carefully patched nets could not withstand this pressure. The very tools of their profession strained against what had just been given. The miracle was not neatly packaged. It overflowed the structures built to hold it. That in itself carries a lesson. Miracles often enter life with disruption. Blessing can upset the routines we guard, breaking through in ways that unsettle even as they provide. These fishermen had longed for success all night, but when it came it almost sank them. It was not quiet, contained, or manageable. It was abundance that exceeded expectations, pressing so hard against what was ordinary that the ordinary nearly collapsed. This catch also sent a clear message. It could not be explained by good judgment, sharp timing, or hidden schools of fish. They had worked all night, checked every possible location, and returned empty. One command, spoken at the least profitable time of day, brought in more than they could imagine. The fishermen knew what this meant. Luck was not in play here. Nature itself obeyed a carpenter's word. Think about this moment alongside our own lives. How quickly we give up on empty nets, the projects left undone, the hopes that seem barren, the prayers that feel unanswered. We tally our effort and conclude nothing will change. Yet here the result was reversed in an instant. Work stayed the same. Location stayed the same. Only the voice behind the command shifted. And with it, emptiness turned into overflowing fullness. The miracle was not about fish alone. The catch was a sign pointing to something greater. These men were not being rewarded for persistence or cleverness. They were being confronted with power beyond their trade. The one in Simon's boat did not simply encourage effort. He controlled outcomes. Where skill ended, his authority began. That contrast, between human failure and divine authority, stood center stage on the water. But abundance did more than fill nets and decks. It pressed in on hearts. These fishermen now stood face to face with provision that was unearned and unexplainable. It was a revelation as much as it was a miracle. The carpenter's word had carried weight over creation itself, and that realization was heavier than the catch. As the boats rocked, the real struggle was not only to keep balance on the water, it was to wrestle with what such power meant. The miracle shifted from an external spectacle to an internal reckoning. This was more than fish, more than relief after a failure. It was a sign that demanded a response, because no one could stay neutral when confronted with authority that overturned both their skill and their assumptions. And it is here the story begins to pivot. The weight of nets and boats became the weight of recognition. Abundance was not just an answer to hunger or a provision for the village market. It became a mirror, showing Simon something deeper and far more personal. The overflowing catch had drawn him suddenly into a different kind of moment altogether, one not about success, but about himself. That is why the next scene becomes so remarkable. The shouting, the chaos, the risk of sinking gave way to something quieter, something unexpected. The miracle did not leave Simon rejoicing over profit. It left him overwhelmed in spirit, cut to the heart in the presence of someone who carried authority far beyond fish and boats. What the nets revealed opened into a very different response, one that pushed him down from his feet to his knees. Falling at his feet. How did a catch of fish turn into a confession of sin? What should have been a triumph for tired fishermen became something much heavier. Instead of laughter or excitement, Peter dropped to the floor of the boat and said, trembling, "Depart from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." Peter sees in that moment not the fish but the Lord, and his instinct is humility, not triumph. As commentators note, when humans encounter divine power, the common response is awe and confession, not celebration. This shift makes sense if you think about Peter's experience. He wasn't naive about the water. His whole livelihood depended on reading the currents, predicting the schools, and grinding through sleepless nights for a catch. He knew what success looked like, and this wasn't it. Nobody drew in such abundance in broad daylight. This was no clever timing or stroke of luck. It was impossible apart from the one who spoke the command. More than fish filled the nets that morning. Holiness filled the boat. It is striking that Peter's first words were not about the miracle itself. He didn't thank Jesus for the sudden wealth. He didn't plan for the market or imagine the meals those fish would provide. Instead, he immediately turned inward, overcome not by the gift but by the giver. The sheer authority of Jesus' word exposed something deeper than hard work or even relief. It unveiled the condition of Peter's heart. Encounters with holiness have a way of doing this. In Scripture, when Isaiah saw the Lord, he cried out, "Woe is me." When John received visions on the island of Patmos, he fell down as though dead. Peter stood in the same line. Success did not swell his pride. Instead, abundance revealed his need for mercy. He confessed unworthiness because the presence of the holy made it impossible to pretend otherwise. Hours before, Peter had struggled with failure. He was worn down, nets empty, arms tired, his expertise unable to make a difference. And now, when standing on the greatest success of his fishing career, he still felt stripped bare. His piles of fish were not proof of status, but a mirror showing how much he needed grace. In that moment, abundance did not hide his flaws, it revealed them. This same dynamic often plays out in our own lives. We assume that success, whether in work, family, or finances, will prove that we are doing well. But sometimes in those very moments when everything appears full, our hearts whisper a different truth. Provision cannot erase the deep hunger for forgiveness. Accomplishment cannot cover over the longing for peace. Peter's story reminds us that our most profound need isn't for more fish in the boat. It is for cleansing and mercy, for the grace that meets us when we see ourselves clearly in the light of God's presence. Importantly, Peter wasn't the only one affected. Luke makes clear that James and John, his partners, also stood astonished by what they saw. Their boats almost sank side by side. Their nets tore under the same impossible weight. Their eyes widened together at the sight of fish rolling in over the edges. This was not one man's private moment. It was a shared revelation of Jesus' authority. That matters, because the call that followed was never intended for Peter alone. Jesus was forming a community, calling a group to a new purpose. Their amazement prepared them to step into something beyond fishing, together. Peter's collapse and confession is all the more striking for what happened next. He begged Jesus to depart, convinced his sin made him unfit even to share the same space. But Jesus did not step out of the boat. He did not walk away from Peter's trembling words. Instead, he gave a calming reply. "Do not be afraid." Those few words changed the entire direction of the moment. Where Peter expected rejection, he was met with reassurance. Jesus did not see Peter's brokenness as a reason to turn aside. He saw it as the very starting point for calling him forward. That is the central hope of this story. Weakness does not disqualify us. Failure does not make us useless. On the contrary, when Peter dropped to his knees and confessed, he opened himself to grace. The place where he felt most unworthy became the very place Jesus spoke peace into his life. Falling at Jesus' feet was not the end of Peter's story. It was the beginning. Let's pause on this. In our culture, we chase success, celebrate achievement, and mark ourselves by what we produce. We imagine that when abundance finally arrives, contentment will follow, but Peter's encounter shows something deeper. Even the most spectacular kind of success can leave us longing for mercy rather than congratulation, and that longing is not weakness. It is the doorway to a new life. James, John, and the others never forgot that morning. The miracle imprinted not just in their eyes but in their hearts. The fish represented both abundance and exposure, blessing mixed with a call to humility. Falling down was the only true posture in such a presence. Yet the kneeling did not end in silence or despair. It led directly into Jesus' promise. Grace did not erase Peter's honesty about sin. It answered it with invitation. Peter asked Jesus to leave. Instead, Jesus stayed. He offered words of calm and reframed Peter's identity in the moment of deepest awareness of his own sinfulness. What looked like a breaking point became the beginning of a new direction. Jesus transformed the fear of being unworthy into the confidence of being chosen. From fishermen to fishers of people. What Jesus said next turned everything around. From now on you will catch men. For fishermen who had spent their lives casting, hauling, and mending nets, that sounded at once familiar and strange. Their daily rhythm was built on survival, food on the table, sales in the market, and boats kept afloat through long nights. Yet this call shifted their work into something far greater. Jesus transformed their occupation into mission. The force of his words carries weight even in the language Luke used. The Greek verb for catch here means not simply to seize, but to catch alive. It wasn't about trapping people or dragging them unwillingly. It hinted at rescue, drawing people out of danger and into life. Just as fish lifted from the water were saved from what would overwhelm them, so the message of the gospel would bring people out of despair and into hope. Jesus reframed their skill set into an image for a much larger purpose. Notice, too, who he chose. He could have gone to scholars rehearsing scriptures in the temple courts. He could have gathered priests or learned leaders. Instead, he called ordinary men with tough hands and weathered faces, men used to hard work, long hours, and cold nights. Fishermen were not fragile. They knew storms and setbacks. They had spent whole nights pulling up emptiness but tried again anyway, because survival demanded persistence. That quality, resilience in the face of futility, was exactly what discipleship would need. When Jesus spoke of catching people alive, he was preparing them for struggle. The work ahead would demand the same persistence as wading through a night of empty nets. Sometimes they would see crowds respond. Other times rejection would sting. Questions would go unanswered, and doors would close. But the act of casting, like their daily cast into Galilee, would need to continue, regardless of success or silence. Their mission was obedience. The results belonged to God. Many commentators also point out a second dimension. Spiritual life was at the core, bringing people into fellowship with God, inviting them into the kingdom. But there was also something social at work. Fishing in Galilee was tied up with taxation, Roman control, and exploitative systems that weighed heavily on local families. So when Jesus redefined their trade, he was also breaking them free from structures that kept survival tied to endless labor for profit. As some scholars observe, this invitation carried both a spiritual and a social weight, not only to bring people to life in the gospel, but also to form new communities where justice, care, and resistance to exploitation could take root. That is why the word picture resonated so strongly with them. These men had spent years doing what their fathers and grandfathers had done, depending on boats and nets to get through. All of that experience suddenly turned into training for something eternal. Casting nets became casting witness. Hauling was now gathering people into God's new community. The hours of patient endurance were now practice for hope that would not fold under delay. Their everyday life was being lifted into God's work. The contrast with their morning could not be sharper. Just hours before, their entire concern was survival. Fish meant food, money, stability. Then abundance came so great it nearly sank their boats. And yet when Jesus spoke, they did not secure the prize to carry to the market. Luke tells us plainly, they brought their boats to land, and they left everything to follow him. Their response was immediate. Nets dropped, planks abandoned, family work put aside. To others on the shore it must have looked bizarre, walking away from the greatest catch of their lives. But in that moment the miracle was not the prize. Jesus was. Such a decision seems almost reckless. Most of us, after an extraordinary windfall, would carefully plan what it could provide for the future, but the fishermen made no calculations. They saw abundance for what it was, a sign, and the sign pointed away from fish toward a mission bigger than survival. Their obedience was not cautious but bold, abandoning certainty for trust. In that way their steps reveal something powerful. Following Jesus often comes with gaps. You don't have every answer in place. You often don't see where the road leads, but you recognize that the one calling is worth more than what you leave behind. Think about the trade itself. Fishing was never solitary. Crews relied on each other, hauling together, repairing together, braving storms side by side. That teamwork would be essential in the mission ahead. No disciple could carry everything alone. Witness would need community. Endurance would require encouragement. Their calling, though personal, was also deeply shared. Jesus didn't form isolated followers. He built a group, shaped to labor as one body. The image of nets, too, carries power. A net only works when woven strands hold together. Individual ropes are too weak, but bound together they carry weight and resist the pull of the water. That became a living parable for their future work. Their witness would reach farther, hold stronger, and endure longer when their lives were woven into one another in community. The heart of catching men is life. It is about lifting people into hope. It is about rescue, not capture, invitation, not coercion. It is the ongoing practice of casting out the truth of the gospel and trusting God with the results. And it is about reimagining community, not built on endless competition and profit, but on care, justice, and shared life in Christ. The fisherman's first step reminds us that when we follow, both survival and success make way for service. In the end, Luke records no hesitation. The choice was clear: leave the nets behind. The miracle had revealed abundance, but the abundance only pointed to a greater reality. What mattered most was not the full boats, but the new direction offered. They stepped ashore, set down their catch, and walked forward. So they left the boats, full of fish, and followed. That will be the model for our response. Direction matters more than perfect preparedness. And as others would hear of Jesus in the days ahead, not everyone responded like these fishermen. Some struggled to believe, reacting with doubt rather than obedience. One man in particular put his skepticism into words, questioning whether anything good could come from a certain small town. The skeptic under the fig tree. Nathanael's story begins with a word of doubt, but it does not end there. When Philip first told him about Jesus, his reaction was quick and sharp. He dismissed the news before giving it a chance. To him the idea did not make sense. But Philip answered in a way that has echoed for centuries. He didn't argue, he didn't try to explain. He simply said, "Come and see." That short line carried power. Philip trusted that encounter would do what debate could not. Instead of piling up facts, he opened a door. Those simple words remain a model even now, because they leave space for the truth of Jesus to reveal itself. Many of us try to convince others by talking more, pressing harder, or stacking up reasons. Philip shows another way. Faith invites, it does not force. He knew if Nathanael saw Jesus for himself, a conversation no man could script would begin. Still, skepticism clung to Nathanael as he walked. His mind was already set. He had measured the idea of Jesus and found it lacking. That weariness of heart is something we know well today. People dismiss faith for being outdated, unnecessary, or shallow. Some close the door before they even look inside. Yet skepticism never disqualifies someone from being seen and known by Christ. Nathanael's doubt followed him on the path toward Jesus, but so did an unseen grace that waited for him ahead. When their eyes finally met, Jesus did not argue against Nathanael's prejudice. He didn't quote a line of scripture as proof. He spoke something unexpected, as though stepping inside Nathanael's own hidden world. Here is a true Israelite, in whom there is no deceit. It was not a clever retort, it was a window into his soul. Nathanael knew this was no guess, no public rumor Jesus could have overheard. It was precise, personal, and it named the honesty at his core. Stunned, Nathanael asked, "How do you know me?" That question hung heavy because his reality had been pierced. He had believed himself unknown, hidden in skepticism, unseen in the private corners of his life. But Jesus answered in a way that exposed far more than a public detail. "Before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you." At first it sounds ordinary, just being seen under a tree. But here cultural detail deepens the moment. In their world the fig tree could be a quiet place of reflection and prayer, a space where hearts searched for God in private. To point to that spot was to point to the unseen chamber of Nathanael's soul. Jesus did not just know his location, he knew his heart. He had seen Nathanael in a place where no one else was watching. That was enough to break down the walls. Nathanael's sharp edge softened into open confession. In a sudden turn he declared, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Doubt melted into worship, because he realized the one he had dismissed already knew him completely. What years of reasoning could not move, one encounter overturned in a breath. Take notice of this arc. We move from skepticism to invitation to revelation to confession. The turning point is not debate, but encounter. Nathanael did not write a list of reasons, weigh them one by one, and choose belief. He was seen, and in being seen, he believed. That is the power of Jesus' knowledge. It reaches to the deepest places, to the quiet struggles nobody else can trace. And this raises the question for us. How do we respond when someone resists faith? Philip shows patience. He does not lecture. He leans into simplicity. Come and see. Maybe that is the invitation you can give someone in your life. A gentle word, an open door, a chance to experience faith not as a debate, but as a meeting with the living Christ. We are not asked to be perfect defenders, but to be faithful inviters. Nathanael's shift also shows us something about Jesus' approach to skeptics. He did not expose Nathanael's scorn as a flaw to be mocked. He honored him as truthful, free of deceit, even while doubting. That is grace. Where we expect rebuke, Jesus gives respect. He creates room for honesty, because he knows honesty is fertile soil where belief can bloom. Think for a moment of your own fig tree moments. Maybe you have sat in quiet reflection, wrestling with questions you couldn't voice aloud. Perhaps your doubts feel too raw, or your thoughts too tangled. Nathanael shows us those places are not hidden from Christ. He meets us there, not with scolding, but with recognition. He sees beyond appearances and names what rests at the core. For many people, this is still the path into faith. Dismissal turns to surprise when they feel known in ways no human could explain. Faith is not always the product of a long argument. Sometimes it is one clear moment where a heart realizes God already sees, already understands, already knows. When that happens, resistance shrinks and reverence grows. It also matters that Nathanael stood among others when this change happened. His confession echoed forward, adding one more voice to the growing company of witnesses. First fisherman on the shore, now a skeptic under a tree, all drawn in different ways, yet each brought to the same conclusion. Jesus' authority reaches deeper than expectations. This variety reminds us that there is no single pathway. For some, abundance opens their eyes. For others, being seen in doubt becomes the turning key. Nathanael's story presses us to consider how we meet doubts, in our own lives or in those we love. We may not answer every question with words, but we can extend the same simple invitation Philip used, to come and see. That is encouragement without pressure. It trusts not our ability to argue, but Christ's ability to reveal. Notice, too, that Nathanael's confession rose stronger than his skepticism had begun. His initial words dismissed Jesus as insignificant. His final words acclaimed him as king. Nothing in between was a debate. It was all the difference of being truly seen. That reality can give us confidence for our own doubts and hope for those who still resist. When we look at these two early encounters, the fishermen with their nets and Nathanael under his fig tree, we see the same theme repeating in new ways. Failure and doubt stand side by side, but in both, Jesus steps in with authority that speaks to the core need. Abundance met futility, recognition met skepticism, and each became a testimony for those standing near. From there, word began to spread. It was not just individuals being changed in quiet moments. Soon whole crowds were pressing close, leaning in, eager not only to see but to listen. And their hunger was not for fish, not for spectacle, but for something far less tangible yet far more lasting. They longed for a word. Crowds pressing for a word. Why did so many people crowd forward just to hear him teach? Luke's account tells us clearly. They pressed in because his words carried authority. Luke 5:2-3. Jesus taught in a way that stood apart from scribes and rabbis. His words were not endless debate or rigid repetition. They carried weight and people knew it. That alone drew them closer, pressed against the shoreline, eager to hear more. Teachers were not new in Israel. Rabbis often taught in synagogues, in homes, in outdoor courtyards, yet Jesus' voice stood out. Those who listened sensed not only instruction but power. His words touched ordinary people, farmers, mothers, children, tradesmen, and gave them a sense of being seen. They were used to teaching that burdened them with obligation. Jesus' teaching instead opened a sense of hope. They were not hearing theory, they were hearing truth that gave life. Picture that scene for a moment. Families rose before dawn to work fields or mend nets. They paid taxes to Rome and to local rulers, living with the anxiety of financial strain and political unrest. Their days were relentless, yet when Jesus spoke, his words seemed like clear water poured into parched hearts. They pressed so near that space disappeared, forcing him to step into Simon's boat. Luke records this detail directly. Jesus taught from a boat because the crowds kept pressing in. Even then, he made the shoreline itself into a listening place. That choice is more than practical. Jesus turned Simon's boat into a pulpit, a workplace into a place of revelation. The water carried his voice, amplifying his words so more could hear. The simple setting shows how God's work often interrupts ordinary spaces, reshaping them for higher purposes. A tool for fishing became a platform for truth. For Simon, it meant his daily trade was suddenly touched by the presence of God. For us, it reminds us God can meet us in the ordinary spaces of our lives, not only sacred gatherings, desks, kitchens, classrooms, even sidewalks. All can be places where his presence speaks. This same theme continues as Luke describes Jesus' ministry. His words never stood on their own. Again and again they were followed by acts that confirmed his authority. When Jesus spoke, demons fled at once, and people whispered at the power of a voice that darkness obeyed. When he touched the sick, healing came swiftly. Peter's own mother-in-law rose from bed immediately after Jesus placed his hand upon her. It was not simply what he said, it was what happened when he said it. Words and actions matched perfectly. For people living under fear, this was astonishing. Illness was often seen as God's judgment or as abandonment. Evil spirits were dreaded, with no hope for relief. Yet in Capernaum and nearby towns, those very burdens dissolved under his authority. Those who suffered no longer stayed hidden in shame. They stood in the open, healed, free, restored to their place within their community. The crowd that first pressed in to hear found that his voice did more than explain. It changed reality before their eyes. This balance mattered. Leaders might speak persuasively yet offer no power. Others might act dramatically but leave confusion about meaning. In Jesus both came together, teaching that people could understand, and actions that confirmed it. The crowd discovered that the words they hungered for actually shaped events. He promised the kingdom of God, and then he showed glimpses of it, sickness erased, torment silenced, provision overflowing. These were not empty speeches. They were invitations to see God's reign in real life. No surprise then that crowds would grow. People pressed closer, drawn not only by spectacle but by clarity. They found his words different from the ones delivered in synagogues. These words were not heavy rules but living truth with power behind them. They weren't looking for polished speech. They were desperate for something lasting. And every time Jesus acted, it confirmed what they had sensed deep inside. God's authority was present. Think again of the fishermen on the shore. They had heard him teach just as the others had. But when their own nets tore with impossible abundance, the truth became deeply personal. They recognized in those bulging nets that the same voice calling the crowd carried power over the very waters they knew best. For them, the miracle connected word and deed in a way they could not overlook. They had listened with the others, but now they experienced firsthand what that authority meant. Even more remarkable is that Jesus did this consistently. He did not only heal or free in a moment of need. Luke notes that he often withdrew into deserted places to pray. Luke 5:16. His teaching, his healing, his retreats into prayer were woven together. That pattern, speaking with authority, confirming with action, and replenishing strength in communion with his Father, became the foundation of his ministry. It showed people that his authority did not come from ambition or performance. It came from a deep well of alignment with God's presence. Pause on this for a moment. Have you wondered why his words still draw people today? We return to them not only because they are old, but because they are alive. Just as men and women press close by the lake, people today lean in to hear because these words still speak hope into exhaustion. They don't simply instruct, they uncover life. And the same balance holds. His teaching is not philosophical musing, it is truth backed up by the reality of his life, his acts, and ultimately his cross and resurrection. The crowds of Galilee sensed this. That is why they pressed near. They weren't lining up for food or spectacle. They were stirred by authority unlike any other voice in their world. When fevers lifted, when demons were silenced, when fish overflowed nets, every act confirmed what they had heard. God's reign was breaking in, and words once spoken by prophets were now embodied in their midst. Reflect on what Luke has shown us so far. Pressing crowds, overflowing nets, sick rising from their beds, tormented freed, and words spoken with power. Together these scenes revealed a steady pattern of Jesus' ministry. People leaned in to hear. Then before their eyes they saw that his word was not only instructive but creative. It shaped the world around them. Ordinary life was interrupted, reshaped, redefined. That leaves an important question resting in the air. If his words carried such authority in teaching and action, then what else might they hold? When he speaks not only over sickness and failure but into the deepest places of the human soul, what happens then? Crowds had already seen fish, healing, and freedom. Soon they would watch him speak directly to guilt and sin, claiming power that no ordinary teacher could dare. And that next moment would press the most urgent question of all: who has the right to forgive? Healing that proves authority. The story of the paralyzed man offers one of the clearest pictures of healing that proves authority. Crowds had gathered into a house so tightly that no one else could get inside. Four friends carried a man who could not walk, determined to bring him before Jesus. But when the entrance was blocked, they improvised with boldness. Climbing the outside stairway, they carried him onto the flat roof, pulled back the coverings, and lowered him on a mat right into the center of the room. Dust and fragments must have fallen as the space opened above. People inside would have looked up in surprise, then back down to see the helpless figure placed at Jesus' feet. Everyone would have expected the same thing, for Jesus to speak words of healing, restoring strength to wasted legs. But he did something no one expected. Looking at the man, he said, "Your sins are forgiven." It was not what the friends had carried him for. It was not what the crowd had packed the house to see. And yet, in that moment, Jesus went straight to the deeper issue, not the body but the heart. Those words stopped the scribes and teachers of the law in their tracks. To them, this was more than surprising. It was offensive. They whispered among themselves, "Who can forgive sins but God alone?" In their eyes, a teacher had no right to say such a thing. To claim to heal the body was bold. To claim to forgive sin was stepping into territory that only God held. The room was suddenly heavy with tension. Jesus knew their thoughts, and he made the question plain for everyone. Which is easier, he asked, to say, "Your sins are forgiven," or to say, "Get up and walk"? On the surface, forgiving sins looked easier because it could not be measured. No one could prove whether it had happened. But telling a paralyzed man to stand left no place to hide. If nothing happened, the claim would collapse on the spot. Then Jesus gave the command, "Rise, take up your mat, and go home." For a moment, silence, then movement. Against every expectation the man stood. His legs braced under him, his back straightened, and strength rushed into muscles once useless. In front of everyone who had seen him lowered in helplessness, he now bent to pick up the very mat that had carried him. Then he walked out through the doorway he had not been able to enter before. The room erupted. Families, neighbors, and strangers looked on with awe. Luke says, "Amazement seized them all, and they glorified God, saying, 'We have seen extraordinary things today.'" Their words carried both wonder and confusion. Some whispered, some shouted, and none could dismiss what their eyes had just seen. For the scribes, the meaning was inescapable. If Jesus' word had authority to make disabled legs walk, then his word also had authority to forgive. The healing had become proof of the invisible. What no eye could see was confirmed by what every eye now witnessed. And just as significant, Jesus used language that underscored this claim. He referred to himself as the Son of Man, a title drawn from Daniel's prophecy. By saying, "The Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins," he identified himself as God's appointed figure of power and judgment. It was not simply a healer speaking. It was one who carried divine authority. This is why the scene holds such weight. The friends who tore through a roof wanted healing for their companion. They received far more. Their effort opened the way for a public declaration that forgiveness had come to earth, and that Jesus held the right to give it. The man walked home carrying two gifts: restored strength in his legs, and restored peace in his soul. Let's stop and ask a question here. Healing confirmed what the heart already felt: God's authority to forgive. What needs forgiveness in your life? We often focus on needing relief, solutions, or answers, yet Jesus highlights the foundation first. Bodies fade, circumstances shift, but forgiveness reaches eternity. It is the deeper need every other longing rests upon. The power of this moment is not only what happened in that house, but what it signals for us today. Faith does not always bring the result we expect, but it does open the way for what we most need. The friends brought the man seeking restoration of the body, but what he received first was mercy for the soul. That order matters. And though Jesus healed to confirm his words, the greater miracle remained invisible. Guilt erased, a heart made clean. We might think of how often we too bring our concerns to God with clear ideas of what he should fix. We imagine the solution, picture the form it should take, and then wait for him to act. Yet sometimes his response comes differently, surprising us by addressing something deeper than we had asked for. Like the paralyzed man, we may look for one kind of answer and find that he uncovers the root instead. The reaction of the crowd reminds us how disruptive this can be. People walked away saying, "We have seen strange things today." That was the only language they had for what had unfolded. The world as they knew it had cracked open. A man who was carried in now walked out. Words spoken over sin had been confirmed by bones and muscles springing to life. Strange, yes, but also undeniable. What Jesus revealed that day was not just his compassion, but his mission. Healing was never meant as spectacle. It was a sign. The fish in the nets showed his authority over creation. The casting out of demons showed his authority over spiritual powers. The healing of the paralyzed man showed his authority over body and soul together, linking visible power with invisible forgiveness. Each sign pointed not simply to ability, but to identity. And this is where the story presses forward. Forgiveness and authority are more than private truths. They shape how life is lived in community. The man restored could re-enter his place among others, no longer carried but walking on his own. Forgiveness also restores relationships, giving people back to one another. The miracle was deeply personal, but it also reached outward, reshaping the life of a household, a neighborhood, even a crowd gathered in wonder. That same movement continues now. What Christ offers is never for one individual alone. It spreads outward, shaping fellowship, hospitality, and community life. When forgiveness is real, it forms space where others are welcomed, even those considered unworthy or overlooked. That is the next step, because authority to forgive proves itself not only in words or healings, but in the way it changes whom we welcome at the table. A banquet for the unwelcome. Why would Jesus choose to eat with people who were known for their corruption? That was a question many asked when he sat down at Levi's house. For the Pharisees, it looked offensive. Sharing meals in that culture carried meaning. It implied friendship, welcome, even honor. Teachers of the law guarded their reputations carefully by avoiding anyone considered compromised. But Jesus did the opposite. He accepted Levi's invitation, choosing fellowship over distance. Levi himself was an unlikely figure for discipleship. He sat day after day at a Roman tax booth, collecting money from his own people. Tax collectors were seen as traitors, profiting from oppression and often adding extra charges to enrich themselves. To the wider community, Levi was corrupt and beyond repair. Yet when Jesus passed by, he looked at this man and said simply, "Follow me." There was no explanation, no scolding, only an invitation, and Levi left everything at once. He walked away from steady income, from his identity as a tax collector, and from the bitter judgment that had defined him. His response didn't end with leaving the booth behind. Levi hosted a great banquet in his house, wanting Jesus to be honored there. But he also invited his circle of friends, other tax collectors and people branded as sinners. The house filled with those most others avoided. In that moment, Levi's home became a surprising stage for mercy. A place linked with greed was suddenly lined with tables, crowded with outcasts and filled with the presence of Jesus. The Pharisees noticed. They saw not only who was seated at Levi's table, but also the teacher who joined them in conversation and food. For men convinced holiness meant separation, this looked like a collapse of purity. They asked Jesus' disciples why their master would choose to recline among such people. To their eyes, a true teacher should keep distance, drawing strict lines between clean and unclean. Fellowship with sinners, they believed, made a person unholy by association. But Jesus gave a reply that reframed the entire discussion. He said, "It is not the healthy who need a physician, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." His words exposed his mission clearly. To seek those considered broken was not a failure of holiness, it was the essence of it. Just as a doctor goes directly to those who are ill, Jesus went straight to those who knew their need. That short reply reversed assumptions. In the Pharisees' world, holiness was shielded from what they judged unworthy. In Jesus' way, holiness moved toward the unworthy, offering presence and healing. The physician image struck deep. It wasn't about brushing aside sin, but about treating it. The Lord was not overlooking corruption, but restoring those willing to follow him into new life. Levi's banquet made this shift visible. His old colleagues and friends, people long excluded from fellowship, now found themselves eating with a rabbi who saw their humanity. In Luke's telling, this feast showed grace at a table level. Meals were not only about food, they were about connection, esteem, belonging. Here the despised became included. The table itself became a living parable of the kingdom breaking into unlikely places. Think for a moment what it would have felt like. Guests entered Levi's home expecting an ordinary dinner, but instead they encountered a teacher who spoke with equal honesty and compassion. They had been told all their lives that God's favor was far away from them. Yet here was a man of God who reclined at their table, who tore no distance between himself and their company. For the first time they might have sensed they were not despised beyond hope. The Pharisees couldn't accept it. To their way of thinking, God's blessing should remain reserved for those who kept themselves pure through ritual and law. Their system kept boundaries high, ensuring distance from all who failed to meet those marks. Jesus broke open that wall. He showed that God himself had come near, not to those who boasted of their righteousness, but to those who admitted their need. That was why he called Levi, why he ate with outcasts, and why he spoke of himself as a physician. It was not lowering holiness, it was embodying mercy as holiness fulfilled. This banquet scene also pointed to transformation. Levi didn't simply adjust his behavior, he shifted his entire life. His house, once a place where taxes were counted and neighbors resented his gain, became a place of community and invitation. His new allegiance to Jesus turned his private space into a public testimony. The act of opening his doors to companions showed his repentance wasn't hidden. It spread outward in real change. The Pharisees saw scandal, but Jesus saw opportunity. The men sitting around that table, the very ones most others kept away, were the ones he declared himself here for. In Luke's account, they are the living example of the sick whom the doctor seeks. Sinners were his mission field, repentance was his prescription, mercy provided the healing. That is why Levi's table mattered. It wasn't a lapse in holiness, but a window into the heart of his kingdom. For us, the challenge remains real. We often prefer safer boundaries, showing kindness to those who already seem respectable. But Jesus' pattern presses deeper. He entered spaces others avoided. He sat at tables where reputations were tarnished. He welcomed those whose names carried stigma. Mercy meant presence, not retreat. The question before us is whether we see and welcome those God sees, or whether we cling to protection that keeps us untouched by their need. In Levi's story, we glimpse hope for everyone who feels far off. If a tax collector tied to Rome's corruption can leave his booth and become a disciple, then no heart stands too far for grace. If his house, once dreaded, can turn into a banquet hall for Jesus and his followers, then no life is locked into its old reputation. Transformation is not theory here. It is shown in bricks, tables, and conversations. That is why Luke includes this moment early in his narrative. It shows what following Jesus looks like. Not perfect purity at a distance, but forgiveness shared up close. The very next steps of the disciples take place in a world of tension, some celebrating grace, others resisting it. Jesus makes it clear. He does not come to affirm the already convinced. He comes to call sinners. And this new direction naturally led people to ask further questions. If Jesus was willing to remake the meaning of holiness at a dinner table, what else about life with him would prove different from the old religious patterns they knew so well? That question began to rise as others watched his disciples. What they did, or did not do, showed that his way was not just a subtle correction, it was something new altogether. New wine and new wineskins. When people questioned the way Jesus' disciples lived, the issue of fasting came up quickly. Others fasted often, to show devotion, to mourn, or to seek God's favor. But his disciples feasted instead. To religious leaders that looked careless. Devotion was supposed to be seen in rules, in discipline, in long hours of restraint. Yet here were men who seemed unconcerned with rituals, and people wanted to know why. Jesus answered not with a lecture but with an image. He spoke of things everyone in the crowd would recognize. No one tears a piece from a new garment and sews it on an old one. No one pours new wine into old wineskins. Everyone knew what that meant. If you patched a worn robe with a fresh unshrunk piece of cloth, the first washing would only make the tear worse. And wineskins, animal hides sewn and sealed, had stretched when they were new, but they grew brittle with age. Pouring fermenting wine into them would end in a split seam and wasted wine. Both pictures were clear. Old forms cannot contain what is new. The meaning reached far beyond clothes or containers. Jesus was showing that the life he brought could not be squeezed into existing religious systems. He was not offering small improvements or a few fresh habits to shore up what was already in place. He was declaring that his way was new altogether, new life, not a patch job, new wine, not repackaged tradition. To try to fit his kingdom into old rules would ruin both. What God was doing could not be managed by tightening discipline or adjusting routines. It demanded a new beginning. Then he added a third picture, one of a wedding. Can you make the guests of the bridegroom fast while he is with them? At a wedding, fasting was absurd. The presence of the bridegroom called for joy, not restraint. Celebration was the proper response. By pointing to himself as the bridegroom, Jesus made the moment plain. His disciples were not ignoring devotion, they were responding to his presence. The long-awaited promise of God walking with his people had arrived, and so the right posture was feasting with him, not fasting as though he were absent. Still, Jesus did not reject fasting altogether. He said a time would come when the bridegroom would be taken away, and then fasting would return as fitting. For now joy was the command because his presence was near. Later longing and seeking would take form in fasting, but the heart of his answer remained. Life with him cannot be boxed into the old routines of ritual obligation. It is a new creation that calls for a new response. This picture challenges how we often try to approach faith. Sometimes we want the comfort of old routines while hoping for new joy. We try to place the life of Christ into the worn-out ways we already know, keeping the patterns that feel safe while asking Him to give us new hope inside them. But that's like pouring new wine into brittle skins. The result is always loss. Jesus' teaching makes it clear. Real discipleship is not about adding Him as a layer to what we already are. It is about being remade as something altogether new. The Pharisees heard these images as threat. They had built an entire system designed to hold faith steady through law and ritual. Their traditions provided order and safety. Jesus' words clashed with all of it. To say that their old frame could not hold his kingdom was to say that their confidence in rules was misplaced. He wasn't reinforcing their patterns, he was announcing their replacement. That is why the idea provoked their resistance, and yet why it brought freedom to those around him. Where performance ruled, he now offered grace. Where striving marked devotion, he introduced joy. Think about how this still touches us today. Many try to treat faith as one more improvement plan, something to make life a little smoother or to ease a guilty conscience. But Jesus' language won't let us reduce it that way. Faith in Him is not stitching His words onto our old habits. It is new clothing, entirely reshaped. It is not pouring His Spirit into rigid and flexible routines. It is letting go of the structures that cannot bend and allowing Him to form something that will grow. He calls not for half measures but for surrender, new wineskins to hold new wine. You may know what it feels like to resist this. Perhaps you have longed for hope but tried to keep it fitted within your old plans, or prayed for peace while clinging to the priorities that always kept you anxious. Every time we want transformation without change, we run into the same problem the Pharisees faced. We look for wine without giving space for a new container. But his warning, spoken in simple images, still stands. Old skins cannot hold new life. Let's reflect honestly. What old structures or patterns do you keep trying to mend with a patch? What rigid habits have you asked Him to bless without allowing Him to replace them? The teaching of Jesus reminds us that new life always grows, always expands, always stretches the container that holds it. If you insist on keeping it in brittle frames, it will break. But if you receive a new wineskin, a life open to His grace, you will see it expand and fill with what only He can give. The disciples learned this firsthand. They discovered that freedom with Jesus meant letting go of ritual as performance and embracing presence as joy. Their devotion came not from proving themselves holy, but from walking daily in His grace. That is why these pictures still matter. They remind us that faith is not a supplement to what already is. It is the beginning of what could not exist before. So let me leave you with a simple question to carry. If you are holding new life in old containers, what one old practice could you gently let go of to let the new wine expand? Because when Jesus speaks, what looks impossible, whether it's brittle skins, patched cloth, or rigid forms, always gives way to something greater. And sometimes it's in those very moments of tension, when the old can no longer hold, that a new beginning takes shape. Conclusion. Empty nets, failed nights, or even skeptical thoughts, these moments may look final, yet they often become the space where God speaks, where obedience reshapes direction, and where purpose is renewed. The lesson is simple. Emptiness can make room for His calling, and trust can turn what feels wasted into something that lasts. If this spoke to you, type "come and see" in the comments or share one of your own empty net moments below. And if you want more stories that help apply Scripture to everyday life, subscribe. Take a moment. What empty net is God asking you to trust Him with today?